Hello Booktube. It's the very last day of February, and that means it's time for me to do my D&D wrap-up. Not Dungeons and Dragons, as Brian Bookish would say, but delights, discoveries, disappointments, and heaven forfend, disasters if there were any. And the first kind of like happy thing that happened to me bookishly this month was that this arrived, and it's a bookish present from Alan in so it came to me all the way from Portland, Oregon, from Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics, and it means that I can enjoy Tom L.A. Books discussions of Dante's Inferno even better because I've got the translation that's got the English and Italian side by side. It's brilliant, and thank you, Alan. But the biggest kind of new thing in February for me was that I'm taking part for the first time in the Booktube Prize as a judge. Now, this time last year, I remember seeing on lots of booktubers' channels, them talking about, oh, well, I can't talk about this month because these were the things that I read for the Booktube Prize. And I thought it was some sort of mysterious secret society that I hadn't been invited to. How wrong I was. The Booktube Prize, if you don't already know, many of you will, but if you don't, it's a lovely thing. It's organised by this tremendous chap called Robert Sheard. I will link to the website that explains how it works. But it's not an elitist secret society, being a judge for the Booktube Prize. Anyone who's a kind of enthusiastic participator in Booktube, whether through YouTube, making videos, an active commenter, or on Instagram or Twitter, it's open to all. And the one thing that you have to be prepared to do, though, is to read, if you're judging around, to read 6 books that you haven't chosen, that are the 6 books that you are allocated in the space of 2 months. And but if that's not a barrier to you, then you too could be a Booktube Prize judge, but not this year because it's already underway. So the very end of this year, look out for when Robert is doing his call out for judges. So the 3 books that I read for that in February, which I can't talk about but I am allowed to mention, are Love After Love by Ingrid Persaud, Redhead by the Side of the Road by Anne Tyler, and Weather by Jenny Offill. So you'll hear more about that after this round is complete. 2 other kind of eventy things shaped my reading a bit this month. Now, at the beginning of the year, I said I was going to try to not let my reading be so influenced by kind of Booktube events and readathons and so on. And I'm sticking to that because what I did with both of those was use them, but not to sort of guide my reading a bit, but not try and fulfill all the prompts or do a bingo card or anything like that. One of them was magic for that, actually, because it was the TBR tackle that was run by Jocelyn of Jocelyn's Bookscapades and Key of Books and Key, and that was to read, essentially to read books that you've been meaning to read for ages and have been on your TBR. And I did manage to read 6 books in the course of this month that had been on my TBR in one way or another, my want to read list, I suppose, for at least 6 months, and that was really satisfying. The other thing that kind of shaped my reading a bit was the fact that it's February's Black History Month in America, not in the UK, in America, and so I took that as a reason to read more Black American writing than I normally would, and so yeah, that was a pleasure. I won't list them because it'll become obvious as I kind of work through my month's reading. But a particularly clear-cut one was that when Tilly and I were looking for what we would do for our discussing drama play this month, where we both read a play and then talk about it, make a video, we read 2. A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom by August Wilson. And we've made a video about A Raisin in the Sun, so I won't talk about that again here. But I was thinking that if you're an American watching this, you might think, you might be surprised that both those dramatists were completely new to me. I had not read or seen anything by either of them, and so they were both really special discoveries for me this month. And you know, how can that be? And you have to bear in mind that if you live in the British Isles, you know, so you've got, like, you know, Great Britain and Ireland, which have produced probably a disproportionate number of the world's sort of most well-known dramatists, I guess, from Shakespeare to Samuel Beckett. It is quite easy, even if you're a keen appreciator of drama, even if you go to the theatre and read plays, it's quite easy to not read very many things that are from beyond, yeah, British and Irish playwrights. So, yeah, it was good for me to be pushed to read something different. So that was great. Now, other discoveries this month. Well, I got to read my first ever book by an author from Laos this month, but I've made a scallywandling video about that, so again, I will say nothing about that one. Another new author for me was a kind of Black History Month choice, and that was Brit Bennett, and I read The Vanishing Half by her. Now, I don't know if you've read it. If you have, do comment and share your thoughts about it. I found it a tremendously satisfying novel. Why was it so satisfying? I think because it does a great kind of like sweep of history. It has political and social comment in it, I suppose, but totally integrated to the story. And it's really a character-driven story. And then you know, all the ideas that Brit Bennett, I'm sure, wanted to get into the story, she does successfully through the characters, not by sort of throwing them in, you know, as add-ons, if that makes sense. And if you have read, as I did a couple of years ago, Passing by Nella Larsen, which is a book from written by a Black American woman in 1929, this is essentially a very fine sort of homage to that book and update on it. I suppose I was shocked. I shouldn't have been shocked, but I was shocked at that issue of how one might choose to pass as white as a Black American woman because of the benefits that might bring you, and then the conflicts that would create for you in psychologically and in your life. That has sort of continued to be a thing, as it were, in the second half of the 20th century. I suppose, yeah, that some of what was most shocking in the book to me was fully appreciating how, as a Black person in the 20th century, and you might feel that Blackness was ugly, or that being lighter was better than being darker. But obviously I've read, you know, on reflection, I realised, you know, that people do, you internalise discrimination, don't you? So that was, yeah, very worthwhile read, and a really an enjoyable, you know, a good read as well as a worthwhile one. Yeah. Another tremendous discovery this month, another Black History Month kind of read for me, was a book of poetry, and that was Daylight by Roya Marsh, and that was something that was recommended by Mark Nash, another booktuber. If I see a strong poetry recommendation from Mark, I would almost just go out and buy it now, because he doesn't read a lot of poetry, but when he does and he likes it, I know it's going to hit the spot for me as well, which it absolutely did. And it's another book that I suppose, through poetry, it's a young Black American woman, poet, relatively young to me, who, yes, I suppose again is exploring how tough it can be to be comfortable in your own skin, your own identity, and joyful about it. And for her, that's also linked to sexuality and her experience of abuse. Tremendous quality poetry, and but I will say no more. I will point you to, I'll put it in the show notes, Mark's video, because that was yes, a much better and more in-depth discussion of the book than I could do here. So but go to that and then buy the book and read it, and you will find it rewarding in ideas and in poetic quality, let's say. Now, sadly, the other book of poetry, well, I needed a second book of poetry this month. I normally kind of try and read one collection of poetry each month, and I needed a second one because the first one that I chose was a terrible disappointment. Now, and it surprised me that it was a disappointment, and I'll explain why. And that's because, so you may not know, but the one of the sort of strongest publishing houses for poetry in the UK is Faber. And a few years ago, Faber hit their 90th anniversary as a publishing house, publishing poetry, and they produced a series of books, 10 books, one for every decade that they had been publishing poetry. And they're like really gorgeous feeling books, you know, got lovely images on them, lovely texture, you know, they're like, and they're all books that they've chosen to kind of be, you know, represent a decade of their output. Okay, so they are all, you know, fine collections, and but also that conjure up their time. So I've read one of those, and you know, generally that's a surefire win. I mean, you know, they might not be perfect. I know, you know, so you could, you know, poke some holes now in Sylvia Plath's Ariel, but it, you know, it is a very important and exciting collection of poetry, without a doubt, even if you don't appreciate or like everything in it, if you know what I mean. The one that I read this time was Wendy Cope, Serious Concerns. Now, Wendy Cope is a very well thought of poet. She's been kind of proposed for the Poet Laureate in this country a few times. This was the collection that Faber chose to represent the 1990s. It was published in 1992. It was her second book, and her first collection had been a bestseller. Okay, I'm going to read you a book, a kind of what I feel was a representative poem from this book as to why this book was a disappointment to me. Okay, another Christmas poem. Bloody Christmas here again. Let us raise a loving cup, peace on earth, goodwill to men, and make them do the washing up. Now, that is a good joke, I guess, but it's not a good poem for me. You know, it's a bit Tumpty and rhymey and funny, and you know, there's a place for humour in poems, there's a place for rhyme and rhythm, you know, and there are some really good poems in this book, but I'm going to give you another one. Loss. Okay. The day he moved out was terrible. That evening she went through hell. His absence wasn't a problem, but the corkscrew had gone as well. Now, again, you know, I'll laugh, but it's trivial for me. Yeah, that was scathing for me, wasn't it? There you go. Not all the poems in that book are bad like that, but enough of them were for me to find it a huge disappointment. Now, my other disappointment this month was a thriller called 3 Hours by Rosamund Lupton, and it wasn't a disappointment because it was a thriller. I really enjoy a thriller. You know, that's something I can absolutely get into. Nice, pacey, good plot. Yeah, brilliant. Why was 3 Hours a disappointment? 3 Hours was a disappointment because Rosamund Lupton, the author, and I think probably, you know, share sort of some political views or views about society, and you know, I totally appreciate why she would want in a thriller about a kind of a school siege to explore the issues around white supremacist terrorism and radicalisation, and how, you know, vulnerable young people can be drawn into that world and radicalised. But she didn't have to like just hit me over the head with a hammer with her explication about it. You know, she'd have like one police officer explaining to another police officer about this is how white supremacist terrorists radicalise young people. And it's like, oh, for goodness sake, you know, just let it happen, please, and that'll be fine. So that did not work for me. And the other thing that didn't work for me was something that happened towards the end of the book, where she chooses to write an event, an episode where some teachers and a group of young people do something, and she wants them to do that to make a point about tolerance and art and how, I don't know, knowing Shakespeare and loving each other can win the day, sort of. Except that she got them to do something that no teacher would ever have chosen to do, because it was rash and reckless. And the fact that it turned out to have a good end, as it were, doesn't mean that that they would have done it. I've explained that in a very long-winded way because I'm trying to avoid a spoiler in case you were planning on reading this book. I'm not recommending you read this book, although it does have, you know, good qualities, and, you know, I rushed through it in a nice sort of enjoyable thrillery sort of way. But that really irritated me at the end of this book. That just but I'm avoiding giving a spoiler because spoilers are a bit of a theme of the month, aren't they? Because of Scott and Nell did their spoiler tag, which I so enjoyed doing, and has provoked some delightful conversation around Booktube in the last few weeks. Another topic that's been kind of hopping around Booktube in the last few weeks is that about kind of bookish snobbery or book snobbishness. Barb and Isabella of the Font did a wonderful video about that, and I will, if you haven't seen it, go and find it. I'll try and link to it as well. This is going to be very long show notes, isn't it? So yeah, and about how, you know, a worry that Booktube might kind of draw you into reading things that aren't really the things you enjoy, or wanting to kind of show off your reading that's, you know, good qualities, you know, I read this and I read that, and I wouldn't read stuff like that. And I really empathised with what Barb was saying. I think I'm a bit of a recovering book snob in a way. What it got me to read, perversely, was a book by that you might think was a book snobby book in a way. It's a book by C.S. Lewis called An Experiment in Criticism, and Steve Donoghue mentioned it in a video a few weeks ago, and I kind of made a note of it at the time because I thought I'm intrigued by that, and it absolutely speaks to this book snobbery kind of concept and how daft it is. Because C.S. Lewis wrote it in, when was it published? 1961, and he proposes in it that that we are mistaken if we try and define good books and bad books by genre, say, or you know, received wisdom, or what the critics say. That what matters, perhaps, in judging a book is how people choose to read it, and that a book which rewards and permits a sort of attentive reading and maybe a rereading, that might be the best way to judge a book, if we're going to judge them at all. It was a short and interesting read, and thank you, Steve, for recommending it. It helped me think about, how I make judgments about books, which I do. You know, I don't think it's a problem to make judgments about books for yourself and make choices about books for yourself. That's not book snobbery. That's book appreciation, and but yeah, to kind of, yes, it's not about what you're told to think. You've got to read, be an engaged reader, and work that out for yourself, perhaps, whilst enjoying other people's recommendations and ideas and suggestions and interpretations. Now, two other books that I read this month, my last two that I'm going to talk about, I think were good books by the C.S. Lewis definition. Yes, because they, now one of them is science fiction or fantasy or somewhere between the two. And he kind of really speaks in defence of science fiction in experiment and criticism, and we know his feeling about fantasy because he chose to write a load, and was famous for talking, as we know. The book that I read was The Obelisk Gate, which is the second book in the Stone Sky trilogy by NK Jemisin. So this one was one that ticked two boxes for me. It was a Black History Month read, and it was a TBR tackle read because it was book two of a trilogy that I read book one of ages ago and kind of never got around to reading the rest. Now, one of the issues with science fiction and fantasy for me, and I've mentioned this before, is the world building side, and alien creatures or different. Sometimes I struggle a bit with that, or struggle to kind of get through that beyond it and start really enjoying the book. And so I suppose in the C.S. Lewis terms, it demands a degree of attentiveness, and then if it rewards that effort on my part, then it is a good book in my eyes. If it puts me through that effort, but then I get the payoff. And reading a sequel, of course, I should have realised, you get that payoff much quicker because you get back into that world. You've done the effort of making sense of it and learning its rules and its language. And so I really enjoyed reading Obelisk Gate, and I'm very much looking forward to reading the final part in the trilogy, and we'll do that relatively soon. And yeah, so that was a success. It's not a standalone book though. Don't read it on its own. You've got to start with the first one, without a doubt. Then I come to my final book of the month. Not the last one I finished, although it was towards the end of the month, but the one that I want to end with in a kind of celebratory and happy way, because we read technically Cramford by Elizabeth Gaskell, and that was my top read of the month, without a doubt. An absolutely solid 5-star book for me. And why? When I read this book when I was 13, I'm not even sure that I finished it. I could not get my head around its lack of plot and why I would want to be reading a book about a kind of a bunch of genteelly poor but trying to keep their standards up, middle-aged women in a little village in Cheshire in the early 19th century. Well, why would you want to read it? Because it is just a joy of humour and humanity, and I can't recommend it strongly enough. So that's my happy ending to my month's reading in February. How was your month?